Right, let's make a start. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 10th in our series of weekly webinars. I'm Robert Parry. I'm a partner in our dispute resolution and investigations team here at Quantuma, and I'm delighted to be chairing this webinar for today. I was thinking last night about previous recessions that I've experienced. I can remember the one in the early 1980s. I wasn't working then, but I was aware of the impact it had on my own close family and friends' families. In the early 90s recession, I was newly qualified and remember working through that reasonably uninterrupted. Obviously, the 2008 crash is fresh in a lot of our minds, and it doesn't feel like 12 years ago, but there you go, it is. But I think now the circumstances are just so different. It just feels very different to previous recessions. How is it different? Well, we've got lockdown life. One difference is I'm now on first name terms with our Hermes and DPD delivery drivers. I saw a post on Facebook recently that said, if Hermes delivered a llama to me tomorrow, I'd just accept it. I've got used to so many deliveries coming through. And I don't know about you, but I'm sort of ready to go back into a real shop and to mix with colleagues in a real office. I think the question is, what will that look like when we get back? Some online retailers were already starting to invest in clicks to bricks, going perhaps the opposite way to what we thought. They were providing experiential showrooms or guide rooms, as the US retailer Bonobos called them. Will we see more the dominant internet businesses investing in and changing the high street model by displacing the traditional retailers actually on the high street? And then with the offices, what I have found is talking to other principals over Zoom and over Teams in the last few weeks is that we're all sort of genuinely impressed and surprised at how well our teams have all proved far more adaptable and resilient to these new ways of working. So what will that do to our offices? How will those change? And I think as the country is slowly and surely being eased out of lockdown, we continue these series of webinars. And in this one, we're going to share hopefully some expert insight with regards to what we are seeing in the current market in commercial real estate. During the webinar today, Paul and Simon will discuss a variety of key themes they are seeing in the commercial real estate sector, including the implications of decreasing footfall across key commercial centres, as well as thoughts for the future. They'll cover more than one sector. You could probably do individual sectors on office, on warehousing, on retail, but they'll try and be all-encompassing. Just on an admin point, the Q&A function is live throughout, so please feel free to submit your own questions in real time. We have got some questions that have been submitted in advance, and we'll try and answer those, and as many others as we can at the end. Obviously, before we kick off, I keep saying in meetings and these sorts of events, I've been really impressed with the way everybody's IT has held up. Hopefully ours will hold up through this. But if we do experience any technical difficulties, please bear with us. So let me introduce you to my two partners who are our speakers for today. Paul is with the dark blue background. If you're looking on the screens, Paul Zalkin is a licensed insolvency practitioner and partner in our restructuring and insolvency team. He's got almost 20 years experience in mid-market corporate recovery across a range of industry sectors, including care homes, real estate, hospitality and leisure, motor retail, and waste processing. His expertise includes corporate recovery, pre-insolvency options analysis, contingency planning, as well as receivership administrations and liquidation implementation. Perhaps I should just ask Paul, just particularly relevant to your experience to what we're talking about today, can you let us know a little bit more about your experience that's relevant to that?
Yeah, thanks, Rob, and good morning, everybody. So I suppose all insolvency practitioners over the course of their career inevitably end up dealing with real estate assets. It's part of the job, of course, because most businesses that we deal with either occupy leasehold or freehold premises, and one has to deal with those as part of an administration or a liquidation. I, in particular, spent 3 years running a corporate real estate or distressed corporate real estate focused team. And that really came out the back of the credit crunch, the 2008 crisis. And in particular there, I was dealing with a lot of the distressed NPL investors, names you'll be familiar with, the likes of Cerberus, etc., who on that occasion saw opportunities to invest in distressed real estate debt and acquire portfolios, and then work through the underlying assets within those portfolios. And often that involved the appointment of administrators or receivers, and that's sort of where I came in. So in terms of asset classes that I've worked on in the corporate real estate sector, it covers pretty much all bases. I think I've dealt with resi, I've dealt with office, I've dealt with industrial, I've dealt with warehousing, I've dealt with hospitality and leisure assets, care homes. So I've got a reasonably good understanding of the relationships between landlord and tenants, the relationships between landlord, tenants and investors, banks, etc. And hopefully I'll be able to explain some of those insights and use some of that experience today.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for that. So joining Paul on the panel, we've got Simon Campbell. Simon's also a partner in our restructuring insolvency team, focusing on corporate recovery, restructuring and turnaround. He provides advice and solutions to accountants, to solicitors, lenders and directors in respect of small to medium-sized enterprises and across all business sectors, performing both formal and informal business reviews where appropriate. His sector experience includes technology, property, obviously, professional services and business services. So Simon, in the same way that Paul has done, do you want to give us 30 seconds on your credentials for today?
30 seconds, Rob, is that all? Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm Simon Campbell I work out of the Southampton office. Much the same as Paul, I'm an IP and, if you want to put it more flatteringly, a restructuring specialist. I am, and IPs are generalists. I'm slightly flattered to be called an expert in commercial property. I'm clearly not. But as Paul says, we have, in all the work that we do, we are impacted by the issues of commercial property. I think the experience that we bring to the party is that we are experts in very little aside from knowing how not to run a business and how to deal with the consequences of that. And that, I think, is particularly relevant in today's COVID environment. And I think that's what we're going to be exploring a bit more of over the next 40 minutes or so.
Thank you, Simon. So enough of the introductions. If we can move on to some of the questions and the discussion points. So the first discussion point, as restructuring and insolvency experts, as you've explained, what key observations can you share regarding the impact of the current distressed business environment on the corporate real estate market? Paul, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Well, I think the first observation that we can share, and it's a pretty obvious one, is that the impact of the current distressed business environment on the corporate real estate environment has been significant. I don't think the full story has yet unfolded. I think we're still in a period where, in particular, an impasse between landlords and tenants is yet to be resolved, and I don't think the conditions are right necessarily for it to be resolved.
Everyone's slightly in shock, Paul, aren't they? Everyone's sort of.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right, and I think a lot of businesses, the context of and the business environment at the moment is in many ways a synthetic one, because businesses are still surviving because of furlough, because of capital support, be it a CBILS loan or a bounce back loan, or particularly in environments where there are large leasehold or indeed freehold estates in certain sectors. Businesses have had the benefit of reasonably significant grants. As long as you sit within the right rateable value band, you will have had a reasonably significant grant, which is actually coming from the Treasury, but it's actually administered by the local authority. And I know that sort of for a business that we've been dealing with, actually since before the lockdown started and since before coronavirus really became the big story it became in probably early February, we were advising that business. And it was at that point in time, and it was a chain of coffee shops. It will of course remain nameless, but it has a footprint across England and up into Scotland as well. And that business, across all of its sites, of which there are 50, was getting pretty close to a formal insolvency event. As things stand today, it has yet to go into that insolvency process. And one of the significant reasons, and probably in fact the most significant reason for that, is because of all the additional support it's received and the fact that it's been able to probably actually improve the position of its creditors during the lockdown period. And this is despite the fact that it has entirely ceased to trade. So never could there be a better example of a completely synthetic environment where a business that is probably balance sheet and cash flow insolvent has been able to improve the prospects for its creditors, not because it's managed to sort of trade out of the position. But of course, I mean, sticking to this question, key observations, the impact of the distressed business environment on corporate real estate markets, we have to sort of separate into the different real estate markets. There will be those, and there are those that are actually performing relatively well, and the story's relatively robust. I mean, you know, industrial, for instance, industrial assets, warehousing, etc. The big stories, though, of course, are about office, retail, food and beverage, hospitality and leisure, and other sort of goodwill businesses. So I think, you know, that's really the discussion. We can probably work through some of those. I should probably hand over to Simon, because otherwise I'll end up sort of talking forever. And we can maybe just work through some of those sectors and give you our observations on what we're seeing in them.
Yes, should we start with shops? I haven't any experience in the last 3 months of shops, but we've seen the collapse of Into. And I think that's probably perpetuating a story that's already started, as you've intimated, Paul, about the shift online. And I can only see this this COVID environment increasing the pace of that. And Rob, you talked about the amount of people turning up on your doorstep. That's got to be the way forward. And I think you were mentioning before we were on, Paul, the issue of TM Lewin looking like it's gone into administration. And I think TM Lewin's got a perfectly good online business, but its loss leader of its shops are simply not viable anymore. I think that's going to be replicated elsewhere.
Yeah, and I think TM Lewin is a great example, Simon, because you know, a decision's been made there following the pre-pack that business is going to become a purely online business. Now, I mean, I occasionally buy the odd shirt from TM Lewin, but that involves sort of going into what seem to be, certainly in London, they're pretty ubiquitous shops. You know, you're never more than, 2 meters away from a Rat in London, or 10 meters away from a TM Lewin shop, it would seem. Well, not anymore. They're closing their entire estate. So the move to online is clearly not just about coronavirus. It is about behavioural change and fundamental changes to shopping habits that we have now witnessed and that have just built year on year on year. Certainly over probably the last 5 years, I would have said have been that's where the real growth has been seen in online, maybe a little bit longer than that. But this is just to do with fundamental behavioural change. And lockdown has exacerbated that. And of course, it's really, really easy to shop online. That's not to say that everybody will shop online. As Rob was suggesting, there's this move towards this sort of experiential retail experience where you go and you can actually sort of browse things, but they're not there necessarily to buy. You would then go and sort of acquire it online. And I've actually seen, as an example of that, and this is a new thing, and others may have seen it, in one of the large shopping centres near where I live in North London. Tesla, for instance, have a store there where they will have, one of each of their models. It's basically a car showroom in the middle of a shopping centre. In that instance, that's a shopping centre owned by Hammerson, and that will be quite an interesting story. Just to sort of segue into that, we've seen Intugo, inevitably, I think, what some will say was a relatively poorly run business with a huge debt pile, which became completely unsustainable. We now have Hammerson. They've actually got a pretty big debt pile as well. So how this is going to sort of play out for the owners of these big shopping centres, and who are going to be the investors who come in to actually acquire them?
Well, I mentioned, since you've asked the question, I'll ship into that. And I think that the issue with commercial property has been that it's become a big investment bucket, which lots of institutions have piled into. I think the growth in investment in commercial property has something like quadrupled over the last 20 years. And masses of people have, institutions, insurance companies, pension pots have a large quantity of money invested in these things, and they've been stable, and they produce good returns. And with a retreat of government returns from government bonds and so on, and stock market fluctuations, commercial property has been seen as a very safe haven for money. You can see all these analysts in London and New York and so on, throwing their spreadsheets up in the air, because no one knows what those returns are going to be over the next 12 months. So what will happen, in my view, is that it will have to revert to something that specialists look at rather than general analysts look at. So you'll have to look at it on a local basis rather than a broad basis. You'll have to look at what can be done in Liverpool, in Northampton, in Southampton, with a variety of buildings with those portfolios. And that will require investors who are much more fleet-footed, can see the opportunities of a local market, can understand what restructuring is required in terms of repurposing, perhaps. And out will go, large funds with stable money looking for long-term returns, because you're going to need private equity to sort it out.
Yeah, and I suppose there's also the question of how do real estate investors value those investments now? Incredibly hard at the moment. In fact, probably almost impossible at the moment to sort of truly value anything, because we don't know where the value proposition lies. I suppose that I was going to say, I suppose that leads on, whilst we're still talking about retail. And I think if we look at some of the figures we've seen over the other day, again, coming back to Hammerson, one of the really interesting figures was that on, I think, Wednesday or Wednesday of this week, they were reporting that they'd received only 16% of their Q2 rent roll from their retail tenants in their various locations. And they'd still only received 53% of their Q1 rent roll. So rent's a really interesting thing that we've got to talk about, because at the moment, tenants, they're locked into leases. Landlords have in many ways had it sort of pretty good, I think a lot of people say. And I'm absolutely not here to bash landlords, because I also think they're having a really hard time at the moment. And I don't think the government's necessarily dealt with them in the same way they've dealt with the tenants. But, upward only rent reviews, your rent's at a fixed point in time. Of course, a lot of people are talking about the model moving to profit rents, which would work a lot better for retailers. Just before I sort of hand back to you, Simon, there was an interesting sort of thing I read yesterday in one of the papers, which was trying to sort of dissect and analyse why the government has given so much more support to tenants than it has to landlords. And one of the points made was that for every job that a landlord offers to somebody, their retail tenants are probably offering 100 jobs. So there are a lot more people employed in the retail space on the tenant side than there are on the landlord side. But nonetheless, I think, there isn't much balance at the moment in terms of the sort of financial support and the legislative support for the retail space. There will have to be a fundamental structural shift. And I think the last point I'd make is that there needs to be a much greater dose of reality and pragmatism in the conversations going on between landlords and tenants at the moment. I think that there are those who, Next is an example of a business that has actually continued to pay all of its rent. There are others who have chosen not to, either because they can't or they won't. That situation needs to be resolved, and I don't believe the conditions exist at the moment to enable it to be resolved without some very firm action on the part of the government.
Okay, should we move on to what I would call the more pubs, hotels, restaurants have become slightly more luxury items, luxury purchases than they were. To me, a pub is essential, but that the problem with those, and particularly hotels, I think people will head back to pubs and restaurants. The question will be whether they are viable with COVID restrictions and so on. But the question is, and no one can answer it, I think we'll give our opinion, Paul, won't we? But will people go back to them in sufficient numbers to make them viable? And you can see that offices are still useful. We'll come on to that later. But perhaps this extends a trend, as we know, with pubs. Pubs have been closing in large numbers over the last 20 years. Perhaps this will accelerate that process. Hotels, you can see that people will rather want to stay in self-contained units rather than hotels for the moment. Restaurants, everyone wants to go to restaurants, but I think in general there will be a flight to particular types of hotels, restaurants and pubs. It's not pubs, but hotels and restaurants. You've got the issue of, in terms of hotels, of holidays versus business. You can see business-focused hotels being extremely badly hit, but perhaps holiday hotels destination places will get away more lightly. Restaurants, I think I saw a potential for something like half of independent restaurants in America may go under. And what do you do with all that property? And indeed, what do you do with all that employment? So that, I think, in terms of fundamental habit change, that is a major problem there. You can see warehouses being all right. You can see basically office space adapting. We'll come on to care homes in a minute, but those leisure activities, and we could talk about bingo and holiday parks. I'm involved in a holiday park down in Devon at the moment. We're hoping for a good year once it starts up. But will people come? And particularly, will people come in September and April and so on?
Yeah, and I think that's interesting, because I do think that there are aspects of the leisure industry that will bounce back. I think when we're looking at food and beverage, when we're looking at the restaurant sector, the pub sector, casual dining, formal dining, etc. That is a really difficult problem, and sort of, I suppose, bringing it back to our question, the impact of distressed business environment on the corporate real estate markets. Well, at the moment, there's a huge problem out there. We have seen so many businesses. I mean, I think just before this webinar started, we were just sort of running through businesses in the casual dining sector, the recent casualties, and it's a long list. I won't go through all of them now because I'll probably forget half of them. But it is a long list of casual dining restaurants that have not survived. They're the ones that got into administration already. The massive question in terms of the impact on the corporate real estate market is who will acquire these assets at the moment. Now, I find it quite difficult as an investment proposition to think that people are going to come in and just pick up these estates on a wholesale basis. And if they do, the basis on which they'll do that will be tough negotiations with the landlord to re-gear all of the leases. So that's going to have a massive impact on pricing, valuation, income generation for those assets. that leads us back to the conversation about the investment community, the pension funds, etc., who are invested in these assets. Although I suppose there's a point to make there that pension funds and other investment funds, all the big structural investors, they have to deploy their capital somewhere. So it's a case of what is comparatively the best investment. And it may well be that they still consider real estate, because people instinctively, I think, like investing in bricks and mortar. There's something quite tangible there where it generates an income. So if comparatively speaking, real estate asset classes still deliver a more stable, a less volatile long-term return than equities, bonds, then there is still an investment proposition there. But sort of pulling it back to, if you are a landlord of a number of units which are designating for planning purposes as restaurant usage, you're going to be pretty worried at the moment in terms of who is going to come in. I suppose there's also the conversation about our planning, our planning regime.
Yeah.
We have this idea of, we designate properties, or certainly within a local environment where they have their local plans, they designate property with a particular, as a particular asset class. That there is an office, that there is a restaurant, that there is industrial and warehousing. There will need to be flexibility around the planning regime. And already, of course, we're seeing, although slightly moving on, we're seeing calls for being able to move office to resi much more easily without planning permission. But I think at the moment, the direct impact of the stressed business environment on the corporate real estate market, so far as food, beverage goes, pubs, etc., it's been huge. And I don't think we've seen the half of it yet.
Thanks, Paul. I'm conscious, Simon, you probably want to add to it, but we spent quite a while on this first question. I'd like to add. I mean, you talked about behavioural change, and I think that's absolutely valid. I just wonder whether, when we come out of this, we're going to have a behavioural bounce, where there'll be more sympathy again for bricks and mortar retailers. And as I said, that I quite like to go to a shop now. The online was very convenient when I was going out for 10 or 12 hours every day. Now I'm back home and in here 10 or 12 hours or 24 hours a day some days. It'd be quite nice to have the experiential experience of going out to a retailer. So anyway, we'll move to the next question, and we can perhaps revisit some of these points with questions at the end. So if we go to our second question, on the next slide, so have the measures taken by the government to provide financial stimulus helped ensure that rent has been paid throughout lockdown? Now, this was something Paul touched on, that businesses are surviving because of furlough, because of CVILs and bounce back loans. And just keen to get both of your insight on that. And perhaps, as I cut across you before, Simon, do you want to take the first answer to this one?
Okay. I suppose the first thing to say is stimulus is not quite the right word for furlough, is it? I think, it's been holding it together. That's what the government's done with the furlough, and the stimulus is yet to come. So there needs to be a huge package of measures that stimulates business once we've started again. I applaud the government, obviously, for producing the furlough measures. It's like my mouth was open wide when I heard the numbers involved, but that is a holding pattern, isn't it? And what they've done is provided business and all of us with a chance to get our heads around what's going on here, and hopefully business and the commercial real estate market in particular has had time to think about what it's going to do, and I suspect that some won't. And there's no doubt that some businesses are no longer viable, and certain properties are no longer useful in their current state, and it's identifying that, isn't it? Paul touched on the whole issue of planning. I think that's extremely important. I think government, because of the planning laws complexity and the various vested interests in planning, and the status quo, have found it extremely difficult to move planning on to achieve what they want to do. And I think this crisis may provoke the incentive to actually top down shake up the planning system to achieve what people want to achieve. However, I think the government and who'd want to be in government at the moment, I'm not sure Boris signed up for this stuff. He wanted to concentrate on Brexit, and he's been dealt with it. But it is what it is, and he has to come up with a plan. But I think going back to the issue of localism, he cannot just throw money at the problem in terms of a stimulus. He needs to funnel it down to people who understand in each area what is going on, whether it be mayors or local business communities, so on, to actually spend this money wisely. And I'm slightly worried about this government, not particularly from a political point of view, but from an experience point of view. They are all very new. They have been given a great weight on their shoulders. And the question is, can they build the trust in their own expertise and the delegation powers that they must use to pass money down to the correct people and to identify how that's going to go? And that's a huge question in my mind. And I think planning is part of that. They can really help by shaking up planning laws. We've had issues around, building around London for years. London needs to expand into the outdated greenfield sites. And there's all those issues around it, for which I'm not expert, but something has to happen with government. It's not just announcing big numbers, it's actually putting together the mechanics of what is going to happen and how Newcastle or Liverpool or wherever it is going to use government cash.
Yeah, I mean, what I'd add to that, and trying to sort of think about if I was to give a basic answer to this question, have measures taken by the government helped to ensure rent has been paid? Clearly not across a number of real estate asset classes is the very simple answer. And I come back to the example of the coffee shop chain that we've been dealing with. Their furlough money that they've received and their other sort of sources of capital they've had in grants and things, I don't think that has necessarily ended up in the hands of landlords. In fact, I know it hasn't necessarily. I mean, landlords, there have been negotiations with them to say, look, we can't afford to pay all the rent at the moment. Clearly, that is the case across lots of sectors, across the office space, across food and beverage in particular. So in many respects, I think businesses have themselves, companies, corporates, have had their own lifeline extended, but they have not used that financial stimulus in particular to benefit their landlords. And I think there are large sections of the landlord community who are very justified in saying, well, it's completely unfair. There's effectively been an environment created whereby there's nothing we can do about non-payment of rent and default under the lease. And yet these people, our tenants, are simply paying us nothing at all, when in fact they could pay us something.
It's the Wild West, isn't it, slightly?
It is at the moment. And I think, obviously we don't want to get political about this, but I think, the government absolutely had to sort of step in and underwrite, for instance, the nation's payroll. That seemed like something that was, maybe this is just that sort of sixth sense you get as an insolvency practitioner. You and understand the things that are your priorities on day one when you go into a business that's in administration and you want to continue trading. Number one, you need the staff on board. So you've got to make sure the staff get paid. Well, I suppose that's analogous to the requirement to ensure that the nation's employees continue to get paid during lockdown, which is why furlough was introduced. Then you've got to make sure you sort of look after your key suppliers. And in an administration, for instance, you have to pay rent as an expense of the administration. These are things that you immediately look at, and you need, of course, capital to be able to do that. So businesses have been sort of kept afloat during lockdown, but I think it is not filtered down to landlords, and I think landlords have been particularly hard hit. All parties ultimately need to come together. I mean, the thing that really strikes me at the moment, and we'll come on to talk about some of the statutory measures, but just a non-statutory measure, the government put together a code of practice which encourages landlords and tenants to, you know, come to consensual arrangements, and to ensure, the spirit of the code of practice is to ensure that no one party bears the entire burden of the risk, and the financial risk in particular, of lockdown. In other words, come to an arrangement. Landlords need to give rent forbearance. Landlords actually need to give a rent reduction. What we've seen a lot of is landlords offering people a deferral of the rent. That doesn't work for many businesses, particularly those operating on thin margins, because you're still accruing a liability. And then when you have to pay back that liability, the question is, well, where do you source the capital? If you're making thin margins, you're not necessarily going to be generating enough cash from the profits that you generate in order to be able to pay loans off or accrued liabilities. Equally, if you've borrowed money to be able to pay back those liabilities, how are you going to service those loans? So that really is not the answer. It's got to actually be rent reductions and the parties sort of sharing the pain, I think.
Well, Paul, you said, I think, in the introduction, that about the landlord and tenant impasse, which we'll perhaps come on to and perhaps move briefly from this, after this question, if we can, on to the next one. But you said the landlord and tenant impasse, at the moment, the conditions are not right to resolve the impasse. And you've both said here that, you know, furlough isn't I think Simon said furlough isn't a stimulus, it's a thing to keep people afloat now. But coming back to your point, Paul, that conditions are not right to resolve the impasse, what is going to change to make those conditions become right? Or if furlough ends, do you think that's going to make the conditions even worse?
Well, I think in order for the conditions to be made right, and I know that we operate in a free market economy and we have a conservative government at the moment, and the principles of that are that you don't intervene, you allow the market to resolve its problems. The idea at the moment that the market can resolve its problems is, in my opinion, a complete and utter nonsense. And the reason for that, I've just sort of gone over it. I mean, effectively, we've got a code of practice which sets out what the government wants to achieve, and yet they've introduced legislation which gives which in fact doesn't give. It prevents landlords from having any leverage whatsoever over their tenants, and it effectively says to tenants, here's a license for you not to pay your rent for, you know, a long period of time. I think that in itself is going to have sort of a significant consequence. So the answer to your question is, I think there is going to need to be, we might need some new primary legislation which actually sets out how that impasse between landlord and tenant is to be resolved. I mean, there may need to be either legislation, and also I think a fiscal response. Perhaps the government is going to need to look, as an example, at reducing, if you were to reduce VAT, then businesses, if they maintain their existing prices, will generate additional profits, and that will give them the cash flow to maybe deal with some of these accrued liabilities over a period of time, just as an example.
Thanks, Paul. I think you touched on really what's coming into our next question there. So if we can move on to that one. You know, what impact do you think the Corporate Insolvency and Governance Bill will have in terms of the impasse? I mean, we've talked in answering the previous question a little bit about the commercial reality here, but talking about the bill itself, what's that going to do to help the impasse? And perhaps Simon, if you want to take that.
Yeah. Well, let's come on to the issue of moratoriums and so on. in a minute. But I think in general it forces a conversation. You know, in my view, slightly contradictory to what you said, Paul. I think landlords and tenants should have been talking over the last 3 months, and I think they increasingly will do. And I agree what the government has done in terms of stopping evictions. And I know in the stuff that I'm dealing with that I cannot move things on in terms of 2 or 3 evictions that I've had to implement. But it forces a conversation, to a landlord to the table, and in many people's view, a redress of the balance between landlord and tenant, which you noted has been very much in the landlord's favour for the last, I don't know, 400 years. And it probably is going too far. You're right, it probably needs to be reined back. But at the same time, landlords and tenants should have been putting together, sorry, I was going to say sitting around the table, but obviously they can't. But they need to be able to put together a plan together to work their way out of it. And I think the fact that the government has stopped landlords from resorting to the courts is broadly a good idea. Then, of course, you've got to have the ability eventually to get back into court if you really have a delinquent tenant and they are being unreasonable. But that initial break has been important, and I think needs to be used.
I wonder, Simon, whether we've got a sort of a load of people listening to this webinar sort of screaming out, well, that's what CVAs are for. It will all be, you know, CVAs. And
yes.
If there are people who are saying that, my immediate answer would be 2 things, really. In order to propose a CVA, you need to be able to put to your creditors a credible plan which demonstrates, with the use of financial models.
Yeah, forecasts and financial models.
Yeah. And that's an incredibly hard thing to do at the moment. So let's just say, for instance, you are in the food and beverage space, or you're in the retail space. That's an incredibly hard thing to do. The other thing is, if your consensual discussions with your landlords haven't worked, and those landlords are ultimately the dominant creditors, what is there to say that they are going to approve the terms of a CVA, given the voting rules? Although, of course, you know, it's 75% by value in the first round of voting in a CVA to sort of get it through. But this is one of my concerns, is that if the spirit of this legislation was designed to encourage people to say, right, you know, you can have a moratorium and it will give you some breathing space, and you'll have a monitor during this sort of moratorium that you can now have, and that monitor will ensure that the company does certain things during that breathing space, and the company will put together a plan in order to ensure the survival of the company. I find that sort of conceptually quite difficult, because as I said, dominant creditors, if they're not prepared to come to the table and negotiate, I'm not sure what fundamental changes would need to take place for them to then agree a CVA.
But I think the point is, in terms of landlords, you have a tenant there. You may not like being not paid rent, but you'll understand why. What you've got to consider is, who is the best, you know, guardian for your asset? Who is, you know, is there anyone else? If you kick this person out and don't deal with them, is there anyone else who's going to come in? You know, potentially in some cases, obviously there are, but in more cases than not, there is nothing else they can do. So they need to work with it. And you mentioned initially the issue of, you know, sharing profits. You know, landlords need to get more involved in the businesses that they of their tenants, in order to understand it, in order to work with it more. You Paul talked about, you know, sort of profit share and so on and so forth. And obviously that there's a huge amount of detail in there, but that's got to be right, hasn't it? It's got to be, you know, people have to be incentivized, and they have to understand more about it. And what it behoves everybody, and particularly the companies and tenants, to do is to get their numbers together. And I think that's where, you know, professionals such as ourselves, but additionally lawyers and accountants, can help by framing the arguments, putting the numbers together, and allowing a conversation to take place between landlords and tenants, that might be fruitful. And you talked about CVA, that's one form of it, and obviously a moratorium is another, and there are other restructuring mechanisms. But the idea of having a conversation with numbers behind it, appreciate it's going to be difficult to forecast, but use your best case and worst case to work with and constantly monitor. It's got to be better than resorting to court in the normal way.
Although I suppose one of the problems, and again, it's so complicated. One of the problems with all of this is that all of those landlords, if they start agreeing or being asked to agree to sort of material rent reductions, then one has to ask, well, what's the consequence for value of that particular property? And then if there's a consequence for value, and let's assume that it drives value down, what's the consequence for that landlord's own covenants with its lenders, for instance? Its loan to value covenants is a very basic measure, for instance.
Same conversation's got to go on above that, hasn't it? Same conversation about what is actually possible now between the landlord and their funders.
Yeah. And that's why this is just the most massively complicated situation, because the landlord community is, of course, so important to our business community. But those landlords, they themselves have their own lenders, they have their own investors. This is not just a simple, have a conversation between landlord and tenant and you'll sort it all out. I mean, it may well be that some landlords, and I have seen sort of quite a lot of intransigence from landlords who just simply refuse to enter into a discussion. In some instances, I've seen landlords writing to their tenants saying, look, we get it, it's really difficult for you, but that said, loans and things are available. There is government support available, and you've been able to furlough all of your staff. So, why should we be the ones to take the pain? So sorry, no, you can't have a rent reduction. Now, whether that is just bloody mindedness, whether it is just intransigence because they're just being hard nosed, or perhaps they're thinking, well, we actually just can't afford as an organization, because not only will we be giving that particular tenant, a rent reduction, but what's the impact of that upon the rest of our estate?
So just before we move on to the questions that have come in from the audience, just perhaps, Paul, if you could just sum up on this particular question, because you've sort of dealt with some of the surrounding issues very clearly. But if you were to say, in a shorter sentence, what impact will the Corporate Insolvency and Governance Bill have in terms of the impasse? What's your view? What impact will it have?
I suppose my short summary is that it will not have the impact that the government would have perhaps wanted it to have when the bill was proposed. This piece of legislation was accelerated and brought forward, and then had certain things sort of tacked onto it as a response to coronavirus. One of the main concerns I have is that the aspects of this bill, as far as sort of real estate is concerned, in particular, the fact that landlords have had their wings very severely clipped in terms of actions they can take against tenants, issuing demands for rent. Rent now has to be outstanding for pretty much half a year. And at the moment, if you have issued a demand, you can't actually take any steps. You can't issue a winding up petition. That is, in my mind, potentially just going to lead to a rash of demands being issued the day after that prohibition period effectively comes to an end. So I think this is not a panacea for resolving the problem.
Right, thank you. Right, some of the questions that have come in. The first one is, it's perhaps almost one that I can answer. What is the new normal likely to be for Quantuma itself in terms of working arrangements, if you are able to share at this stage? Well, it is like I suspect many businesses, and talking to friends and colleagues around the industry and the referrers that I work with, a lot of people have done the same. We've surveyed our teams nationally and said, what do you want to do? I mean, I said in the introduction that we've been very impressed with the agility and resilience of people, and this sort of move to more flexible, agile working has just been accelerated by this process. And I'm really impressed. I'm impressed the way technology's worked, and hopefully it's working today so you can see us. And we're looking, for new offices for Manchester, which is the office I'm based in. And what was perhaps lower down our list of choices because of size has now been elevated in our list of choices, that we've decided, well, actually, we'll slightly remodel the office. We'll go for something a little smaller. We'll make the environment more comfortable, and we'll make people's home working environments better for them as well. So I think, from our point of view, we are still going to have offices. We're still going to invest in them. We want a Quantuma brand identity for the offices, but it's probably going to be different to what it would have been if you'd asked us a year ago. Hot desking is perhaps difficult at the moment, but I don't see that's an insurmountable problem. And if people are wanting to work 3 days, 2 days, home and office, or vice versa, I think that's fine. What we're finding is, I suspect as most people are, that some of our younger team members want to work more in the office. So even though they are perhaps the more technically adept or technologically adept and more used to agile working, they're the ones that want to spend perhaps more time in the office for the social aspects. But I think it's a real range of what people want to do. And because we've been impressed with the way people have worked, we can actually be quite flexible. And I think talking to other principals across other businesses, I think that's quite a common message. The next question is obviously quite specific. What changes are anticipated in manufacturing, storage, and associated office rents over the next 5 to 10 years? The question says North Dorset and South Somerset in particular, if you can be that specific. Or
any particular wards within those boroughs?
Or Southern England out of town industrial areas in general. So what's going to happen to rents in Southern England out of town areas?
Simon, have you got your crystal ball there?
I think you're talking about three different things there. Offices, warehouses. I think we talked about. Have we talked about out of town versus in town? Obviously, out of town is going to rents are going to increase. There's probably a lack of space out of town. I think office rents are going to decline, particularly in cities. I think if you start using a little less space in major cities, it has a huge impact on returns from rents, as I understand it. And I think in terms of how to deal with it, I think there's going to be a massive uptick in repurposing buildings, reorganising what we've got, and a lack of building of new commercial premises. I think everything's going to be focused on sorting things out, identifying the problem with property is everything moves pretty slowly, and it's not like making widgets and so on. Things move quite slowly, and you have to divine what is going on and put into place a plan. And I think that's going to be the issue is going to be, what is this building going to be useful for now? It's not quite right. This office isn't quite right. We're going to have to reorganise the seating and so on, but basically it's okay. Or this can never be a restaurant anymore. It's just not going to work. What could it be? I think that's going to be the major issue. I can see that the north-south divide coming in again. In terms of, I suspect that the north will be harder hit than the south, but everyone's going to be hit, aren't they?
Thanks, Simon. Perhaps address the next question to Paul. I'm conscious we've 5 minutes left of the session. I'd like us to finish on time. The question is, do the panelists believe the suggestion that the office is dead? Whilst we can work from home, businesses need to interact face-to-face with their staff in order to create a brand and build loyalty to that brand, which perhaps touched on some of my answer to the first question. But Paul, do you want to answer that? Do you believe the office is dead?
No, I definitely don't believe the office is dead. I think Simon made the point, and you've made the point, Rob, that there's an important role for social interaction within the office between colleagues, between, with clients, and not just social interaction. When I say social interaction, I don't mean, your client's going to come in for a game of pool or, play on your table football if that's what you want in your office. But, face-to-face meetings do still have a role. I think clearly we now all understand that we can operate really effectively, and the technology will only get better, of course. I mean, it's now we've all got so used to using this sort of technology. But nonetheless, there will be the need for face-to-face interactions. I think the office will just change massively, and there will be a distinction between out-of-town office and city centre offices. I think it will be interesting to see how flexible workspace providers slightly adapt their offering, because I think a lot of people, and I suspect that, Quantuma, we may fall into this category where we want more flexible sort of workspace, flexible office space. We will still want a location. We will still need some meeting rooms. But will office tenants want to be tied to longer term, more onerous leases, or will they want much more sort of flexible arrangements? I think the latter is really the answer to that question. And I think the office, it will change, but it is not dead.
Thanks, Paul. I mean, obviously, I've got experience of the WeWork model, and there's many strengths with WeWork. And one of the attractions for a lot of the people there is the very sort of large common areas. And you talked about table football and the like. I wonder, post-COVID, where those common areas will be as popular, and I've seen from the Manchester one, the sort of alternate seating blocked now, and the kitchen areas, people treating them with some concern. Perhaps just one quick question to each of you before I wrap up, because I'm keen we finish on time. Perhaps go to Simon first, and in a short answer, what one piece of advice would you give to commercial tenants now? So for the tenant side.
Numbers. Get your numbers together. I think the only way you're going to survive this is by talking to your accountants and other advisors, putting numbers together and having a clear idea of what is possible. Extremely difficult if you're a pub, hotel, restaurant, but you've got to do it, and you've got to monitor them every day, and you've got to be able to talk to your stakeholders, your landlord, obviously, but other stakeholders as well, your bank and your an HMRC eventually. And I think that is going to be absolutely crucial to know where you are and where you're going much more clearly, rather than using hunches.
Thanks, Simon. And Paul, inevitably the same question to you, but this time, what one piece of advice would you give to commercial landlords?
Well, I suppose I can only talk really to what I sort of see happening out there at the moment in terms of the conversations I'm having with both tenants and landlords. The problem I see at the moment with the landlord community, I say a problem. My constructive criticism and feedback to certain elements of the landlord community is that they need to be more open to finding negotiated solutions, consensual solutions, and to having conversations rather than just relying upon the status quo. That's where I see things breaking down at the moment, and no one is going to sort of win if a landlord just digs their heels in and says, well, we'll wait until the point at which we can issue demand and then we're going to go for the jugular. That's not going to work. So I suppose talk to your tenants and be open-minded to the idea of coming to a consensual arrangement with them.
Thanks, Paul. Thank you both for that. I mean, I won't summarise all of it because obviously we've got through quite a lot there, a lot of insight given. Thank you very much. I mean, the two things that sort of came out to me were, I think Simon raised and probably Paul and both of you touched on, was the planning issue and repurposing. You know, as the city centres change and as offices change, the planning regs might need to change to repurpose the use of buildings to give landlords other options. And Paul's comment that making sure that the nation gets paid through furlough, and the sort of parallel of going into administration and dealing with the issues. So I think nobody quite knows yet where we're going, but hopefully the insight that Sam and Paul have given has been useful, so I'm very grateful to them. And just as we finish, hopefully pretty much on time, lastly, as always, thank you to Vidya and our other outstanding colleagues in the marketing team for putting this together. We would be lost trying to do these sorts of things without them, and we're very, very grateful. So thank you to everyone who's attended, who's participated, those who sent in questions. For any other questions we haven't managed to get to, we'll try and deal with them separately. And in the meantime, I hope everybody has a good last day of the week, a good weekend, and stays safe. So thank you very much.